Hey, Luke Ayers here again. Today, let's just hit another nail on the head. Let's talk about this thing that just gets pressed and pressed and pressed and pressed and pressed so much, and that is ISO. ISO. Let's just quickly re-clarify what ISO is. ISO, if you have a camera, ISO, you have a sensor in this camera. This sensor is what records the light, captures the light. It's the inner most important thing inside a camera, which actually records the light and turns it into a file for you to then look at later. ISO is how sensitive that little screen is, that little digital sensor thing is to the light, all right? And on cameras, you can adjust, on digital cameras, you can adjust this ISO setting. A high ISO means it's more sensitive to light. A low ISO means it's less sensitive to light. Okay, so if you have like a low, not much light in your environment to take a photo with and your photo's coming out too dark, you can adjust the ISO setting to make it more sensitive to that small amount of light to make your picture brighter even though you're in a dark environment. Okay, now what gets emphasized too much to the ridiculous point is needing this ISO to go so high that literally you could be in a pitch black room and take a photo and make it practically look like daytime because the ISO can go so far and blah, 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 and you've got to get this camera because the ISO can go to 26 million, blah, blah, blah. Now, the point that people have in mind when they're thinking about this is also the point of the higher you push your ISO setting, because it's sort of like putting nitrous oxide into your car's engine, it's going to make it go harder and perform, more forcefully. But the downside to using high ISO is that the higher you go, the more you tend to introduce what's called noise or grain or those little speckles where the colors and the stuff in your photos start to like degrade and start to get all speckly and blah, blah, blah. This happens progressively more the higher your ISO goes. So then camera companies use this as a hook for you. They say that, well, this camera can go to ISO 12 million and you still can't see the little speckles. All right, and someone might reinforce that. I mean, whose idea was it that having grain in a photo is a bad thing? I personally love old film photos on black and white where it's just like the beach, how much grain there is. Like that's an aesthetic for me. I like to see the grain. And here we are being told that, no, you need to get this camera because it can push the ISO so far and you still won't see that grain. Maybe I want to see that grain. On my Nikon here, for instance, I'll pop this up to ISO 6400, put it in black and white mode, and it looks like old black and white film photos because you get that grain. And this is a 2012 model, so, it doesn't have the latest technology, so I'm going to see that grain, and that's going to equal a shot that people won't like because the people who haven't even been taught out there that grain is a bad thing will not like my photo because I pushed the ISO too high and I didn't have that advanced sensor that was in the next model that came out just 1 month after this one. And I should be afraid right now. And I should definitely throw this in the bin and go down to the shop and empty my bank account. This is an extreme exaggeration, but I like to exaggerate it because it is BS. It is BS what you get told about this ISO-ness. Now, here's the other thing that I personally find to be very true. This camera, for instance, it's 10 years old, whatever. I can shoot this ISO up to, 12,800, whatever. But I've never shot a single photo in my entire life above ISO 6400. You know why? Because honestly, if you have to raise your ISO that high, I don't believe you're doing photography at all because photography is about using light. If I have to go higher than ISO 6400 on a camera, I just add another light. I will increase the power of my light, not having to force my camera into overdrive to capture the little specks of that lamp and make sure that that's bright enough. No, an actual photographer, a professional photographer would say, okay, it's too dark in this room. Let's add a flash. Let's add a light. Let's open the window a bit more. Why do you need to get the camera to do all the work for you? No, increase the light in your environment. And then here's the other thing, right? You can get away with using a stupidly old camera that's got a really bad digital sensor and which you couldn't push the ISO very high at all, simply by just having more light. Just have more light. The light's what the camera records anyway, so if the camera's hungry for light, give it more light. Don't try to push it and squeeze it that extra mile when its legs are breaking. Give it more light and you can make any camera look good. Honestly, because photography is light writing. You're writing with light. And it's kind of like, this is why I think it's stupid. Like, you're not really doing photography if you have to get your camera to somehow see that person in the pitch black room when you could just turn on the room light and you would see them. So ISO is ridiculous to me, okay? All right. I would deliberately use high ISO on a bad sensor camera that doesn't have, a good high ISO for the specific reason is I want to see some grain. For my personal photos, when I'm, just creating things that I think look interesting, I add grain to my images in post-production. When I'm editing, I add grain because I like grain. I like the noise. I think it gives it character. It gives it something special. Makes it look a bit more like film, Get away from all this digital cleanness. Who said you had to live in a white room all your life, Go live in a hole for a little bit, Go camping, People enjoy camping because it's a little bit dirty. It's entirely a preference thing again, okay? All right, there's no right or wrong. I'm just telling you my thoughts here. Don't buy a new camera because it says it can go to ISO 40 million, okay? No one cares.